Well, thank you very much. Elder. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I want to thank you, Tim, for that. I could listen to you all day. Just before beginning, I really want to say one thing. Jerry mentioned that he had been down to the Smithsonian, that you had feted him. I've been to the Smithsonian a number of times, and you have never feted me. In fact, I will tell you, I was at the Smithsonian about 2 years ago, and I would recommend to all of you that you visit it. The one thing that struck me very, very much was the degree to which Canadian issues and Canadian history is represented there, in terms of the First Nations, but also in terms of the Inuit, Mary Simon, or Gary Lipinski, in terms of the Métis Nation. The fact is that I simply could not believe that an American institution, or an institution situate in the United States, would show such interest and understanding beyond the hemisphere. And I didn't understand why until later on I met Tim. And the only thing that I can really say is that if Washington wants to turn things around, they should appoint somebody educated in Canada every important post down there. In any event, I want to add my voice. I want to start by acknowledging and thanking the Neutral Nation and subsequently the Six Nations, as we are visitors in your territory. I also want to thank the Aboriginal Policy Research Consortium based at Western. I want to thank the National Museum, the American Museum, the Smithsonian Institution, and I want to thank Academica. Yeah, well, that's hard to pronounce in the morning. For their initiative. I want to thank you all for convening what I believe is going to be a very important two-day summit on Indigenous education. The importance of this coming together cannot be overestimated, nor can the fact that it's being held the day after the Chiefs Assembly on Education that just occurred for both are significant steps as we all, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians, move to put the education of the youngest and the fastest growing segment of our population, the First Nations, the Métis Nation, and the Inuit, at the top of the learning agenda where it belonged. Indeed, every Aboriginal leader I have ever spoken to has identified education as the key to the social and the economic problems facing their people. And it's in this context that I thought I would spend a bit of time speaking to you about the initiatives that have been undertaken by those of us from MAEI, Carlana Lindman, Marika Vanderkook, and a number of other people. And we did so really based on the following thesis. While quality post-secondary education at our colleges and our universities, our technical and vocational institutes have improved dramatically. They've got a long way to go, but they have improved dramatically over the course of the last couple of decades. The same cannot be said for the pillars on which all of this higher education is built, and that is to say, our elementary schools and our secondary schools on and off reserve. So for this reason, this is where we at MAEI decided to focus our activities, our priority being where the gaps are the biggest. In the 4 short years that we've been in operation, we've developed a number of programs, which I'll describe to you ever so briefly. One of these is the Promising Practices website. If you're a principal or you're a teacher at a school in much of northern Canada, the closest school is probably hundreds of kilometers away. You certainly don't have the opportunity that you do if you're teaching in Niagara-On-The-Lake, where not only do you have the Ministry of Education in Toronto, but that you've got the local school board, you've got other schools, and you've got a huge body upon which you can draw. And so we created this website, which essentially brings promising practices developed by education authorities or other teachers in schools across the country and, in fact, outside of the country. And it's really worked incredibly well. We're getting all kinds of hits. We're getting them from Canada, from the United States. We're getting them from New Zealand, Australia. We're even getting them from China. Another program is the Accounting Mentorship Program. I was on a plane and I was talking to a friend of mine who was a professional accountant, and I asked him how many Aboriginal Canadians are partners in the major firms. He went on his BlackBerry and came back as we were sitting on the tarmac. You've done that for a long time. And he went on and came back and said there is not one Aboriginal partner in a major accounting firm in this country. I said, what is the matter with you guys? And then they said, we can't recruit them. We can't recruit them because they're not taking accounting in university. So I got a hold of a friend of mine who runs the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants. When I was the Minister of Finance, he ran the tax department, and he's now desperately trying to basically get back in good with God. And I said to him, I'd like to meet with the heads of the major firms, and I did. And I said, look, you've got offices across the country. You're looking for young people who will become accountants. Why don't you start to give them intern jobs when they're in high school? And they all said yes, just like that. And now in 10 cities across Canada, we have got major accounting firms providing internships for young kids who are in high school. Hopefully they will become accountants. If not, they'll become engineers, lawyers, or they may become whatever you want. But the fact is that this is the kind of thing and the kind of relationships that I think have to be established between Canadian professions and business with, in fact, the youngest and the fastest growing segment of our population. Another program, we're in 2 schools, Kettle and Stony Point and at the Walpole Island in southwestern Ontario, essentially working on literacy, grades kindergarten to 3, but are based on a program that was established a number of years ago by the Ministry of Education in Ontario, turnaround programs for primary schools where in fact there has to be a focus on literacy or numeracy. And in the past 3 years, these programs have worked tremendously well, thanks to the dedication of the teachers and the principal and the band councils in these 2 communities. And this is the kind of program which I think working together in partnership, which I think is so important, that we can do across the country. And then the final one, well actually it's not the final one, I'd probably say this is going to be the end of my speech too, but I won't. My father was a politician. He said, if you're going on too long, Paul, just stand up in front of everybody and tell them that you're speaking too long, that you're going to stop soon, and then you can speak forever. But anyway, the entrepreneurship program essentially recognizes that young people who are thinking of dropping out of school may well stay in school if they understand that, in fact, there is a reason for staying there. That sometimes young people find algebra, geography, or whatever it is too abstract and they don't understand. But if they understand the reason why you study geography, the reason why you've got to study mathematics, then they will stay in. And so what we have developed is a business program based on a program initially established in the United States, but also based on the provincial curricula across the country. We started in a school, in the Cromarty School in Thunder Bay. And then gradually we started to spread into Western Canada. And about 2 years ago, and this is really quite exciting as far as I'm concerned, about 2 years ago we took 2 of our teachers and they said, we have these programs which are based on things developed by the provinces, things developed in the United States, based on business programs established by mainstream business in North America. But we don't think this is what we want. The fact is that the first peoples of this country traded right across this continent. They have huge history in what business is all about, and it's not right to say that they were only going to they're basically going to be reaching out and taking charity. We think that they are in a position, based on their history, what they can develop the great businesses of this world. So we took 2 of our teachers and we asked them to take 2 years off. And they have written the first workbooks, the first textbooks, the first high school workbooks for students ever written by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. And these workbooks are now being asked for right across the country, and they're being asked for again, and I mentioned in New Zealand and Australia. And these are books based on the symbols and the understanding and the history of the first peoples of this land. And they're a tremendous success. And I think what it demonstrates in this business program, which is now taking off right across the country, is that if you understand that you reach across chasms of misunderstanding, and what you decide to do is to go to people and within their culture and their identity and their traditions, build on their strengths. There is nothing that can stop them and nothing that can stop this country, and that's what we're doing. And I feel very good about it, and we're going to continue doing it. And as well, we're working on new programs, and the other programs that we hope to be announcing soon, again in an effort to fill the existing gaps which exist, and always as a result of the knowledge, the experience and the insight of Canada's leaders in Aboriginal education. So many of you that I know who are in this room this morning. And all of this being said, there is one other program we have underway, and it's the one that I would like to spend a bit more time on in these remarks. When Tim, this is my water. It's water. It's water. This must be Ontario. Tim mentioned in his remarks at the beginning that the time of this symposium was set to coincide with the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812. Well, I believe it would be worth our while to address, in that context, the uncomfortable fact that we don't teach Canadian history very well in our schools, and Aboriginal history barely at all. For this reason, a couple of years ago, MAEI forged a new relationship, a new partnership with Free the Children. Now, I'm sure that many of you are familiar with Craig and Mark Kielberger's historic mission of children helping children through education. While most of their campaigns are concentrated on issues abroad, our partnership is focused on raising the awareness among young Canadians of all backgrounds as to the history, the culture, and the traditions of our country's First Peoples. Our partnership seeks to inspire Canadian students to become agents of change. It's a 2-week annual program where teachers have access to lesson plans that help teach the rich history of Canada's First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation. I'm told that in at least 40 schools across the country, our course is now underway, and we hope to increase this number every year going ahead. Now, why is this important? Well, I believe that it's important because when Canadians study the history of their country, it should be the history of all of us, not just those of us who arrived after the European contact. I want to give you an example of what I mean. I was born in Windsor, Ontario, which is a couple of 100 kilometers south of here, where we also make wine. At home, wandering around the Canadian side of Lake Erie and the Detroit River, much like Niagara-On-The-Lake, it'd be hard to miss all of the historical markers that demonstrate the battles of the War of 1812. That being said, the history of the war was not taught to me in school, or if it was, I probably missed that morning. But the war really didn't enter my consciousness until I was about 14 or 15 playing in a baseball game in Detroit across the river. Before the game, our coach, who was a history teacher, told us that our rallying cry for the game was "Remember the War of 1812." Now, of course, the American players asked us, "What's the War of 1812?" To which most of us answered, "I don't know, but we beat you." It sounded pretty good. Actually, it sounded very good to me. Anyway, in the bus, on the way home, the coach, realizing that none of us knew what the War of 1812 was, gave us a complete history lesson on it. A complete history lesson with one exception. That exception became evident to me a couple of weeks later when I was walking down, and those of you who know Windsor, walking down Tecumseh Road in Windsor with my father, and I asked him who Tecumseh was. And he told me the story of the great Shawnee warrior, whose exploits along with other native warriors had tipped the balance in our favor in the War of 1812. Now, I remember how struck I was by that story, struck by it to be sure, but I was struck even more so when I began to realize that when our coach, who was after all a history teacher, does this mean anything? I don't know. Never happened to me when I was Prime Minister. Anyway, I remember that this coach, who was had been a history teacher, who was a history teacher, and was a really good guy, told us about the war, he never once mentioned the role of the First Nations and the Métis Nation in it. So the question is then, you'll say, well, why do you think that story is important to tell us here? Well, I believe it is important because unfortunately the failure to know the truth of our history too often clouds the understanding of Canadians on so many of the issues affecting Aboriginal Canada today. For instance, in a recent poll, over 2/3 of the respondents believe that Aboriginal Canadians receive too much support from government. Too much support? I don't think so. Not, for example, when on the basis of fairness or need or whatever basis you want to calculate, Aboriginal Canadians receive anywhere from 20 to 30% less in per capita, in welfare, in health care, and in education funding than do non-Aboriginal Canadians. And I believe that if Canadians truly understood this, they would be outraged at the unfairness. Even more so if they knew that the causes of all this lie deep in the evolution of our history. We are here to discuss the future of Indigenous education in Canada. Well, while I know that you all know this, I'd like to begin by discussing the history of Indigenous education in Canada. The European explorers believed that they had discovered the Americas. And that's understandable. Half of them thought the world was flat. What is not understandable, however, is that that's also what we were taught as children in school, when in truth the only things that the Europeans discovered was that there had been vibrant societies living here, educating, trading, sharing among themselves since time immemorial, and that the history of Canada that should be taught is one that runs through their camps, their villages, their hunting grounds, and their sacred places. When the settlers first arrived here, there was for a while, and you know this well better than I, a measure of working together, for they needed the first people. There was trading to be done. There were villages to be built. And there was a hard land to be made somewhat easier by working together. But as the years passed, survival for the newcomers became more and more assured. Thus, new governments began to regard the First Nations, the Métis Nation, and the Inuit with indifference or worse. Treaties were made only to be broken. Promises were made only to be forgotten. But this only got us so far, for they were stubborn, these first peoples. So then we began the next step of colonization, and education was its instrument. From the start, we told North America's first peoples that all that was ours was good, and all that was theirs, their history, their traditions, their beliefs, was irrelevant. Tim mentioned that I've spent a lot of time in Africa. They did the same thing in Africa. How do you control a people? You control the people by telling them what they believe means nothing. You go in and you say, we have got bigger guns, and therefore it is our philosophy that is by far the superior one, and everything you believe is wrong, and stop telling your children. The same thing. We then started to attempt to indoctrinate them in teaching methods which violated their traditions and their identity, and which they simply couldn't understand. But unfortunately, but ultimately, because of their strength of will, colonization, the attempts to eradicate their culture failed. And so what did? We upped the ante. We began to use education as the primary means of assimilation. We took young children from their families and we forced them into residential schools, immorally forbidding them to speak their languages or embrace their traditions, and in the course thereof, creating a fundamental distrust of formal education, which we live with today, and another byproduct, generation upon generation of parents who were deprived of the ability to learn parenting. And then finally, 5 or 6 generations later, when the consequences of the residential schools became so evident that even those who sought to destroy the Indian and the Indian could no longer support them, we gave them the right to have their own schools, which we promptly underfunded. The very kinds of schools which for other Canadians are a universal free good, and thus are fully funded. Well, that's the end of my history lesson, for it brings us really up to where we are today, underfunding Aboriginal schools, which is simply the repetition of an unspeakable discrimination that began early in our history and from which we never seem to learn. So I would ask you to keep one thing in mind as you begin your discussions today. The agenda that you have before you, curricula, culture, is crucial. But none of it will be achievable to the extent that it must be if young Indigenous students are deprived of the funding they require that all other students in this country receive as a matter of right. Now this, the federal government makes two arguments. The first, which they just simply did 2 days ago, is to deny that it is underfunding Indigenous education. Well, let the person who argues that, let that person speak to young Aboriginal students who are dropping out of school because they've been sent to schools to which most Canadians would refuse to send their children. Schools without adequate teaching, schools without science or computer labs, schools built on toxic dumps. The second argument that the government tells us is we have a deficit. We have a deficit and we cannot afford to provide the funding for Indigenous education, let alone provide for the large catch-up that is required because of the decades of neglect. The government will tell us that for needed for other purposes, the $5 billion they expropriated from the Kelowna Accord for education, healthcare, water, and housing. Well, let me tell you something. I can be accused of many things, but not knowing how to deal with deficits is not one of them. So let me tell you, if a deficit is going to be dealt with successfully, we must all bear the burden, not just a few who are unfairly targeted because it's easy to do. And what does this mean? It means that some spending can be deferred. If you don't build a road this year, you can build it next year. But if 6-year-olds don't learn to read by the 3rd grade, they'll play catch up for the rest of their lives. If you're only 6 years old once in your life, and if you lose that year, you lose it forever. So don't tell me we can't afford to properly fund Aboriginal education. The fact is we can't afford not to. The question is, we teach the Charter of Rights. How do we do that if we practice discrimination in our school systems? As Canadians, and I am now coming to a close, maybe. As Canadians, ours is the privilege of living in a country that is fair and decent to its core. As a society, we have labored for justice, and as a great measure, we've succeeded. But when we look at Aboriginal Canada, we are blighted by our blind spots, by years of attempted assimilation, by unjustifiable poverty within our borders and on the margins of our common life. And as long as that remains, as long as Aboriginal Canadians feel the stifling melancholy of dreams undreamt, the promise of Canada, the full promise of Canada for all of us, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, will say forever unkept. We are a kind nation. Let there be no doubt about that. And Canadians are a good people. It's not out of malice that we allow these conditions to persist, this unfairness in our midst to persist. But for too long, we have chosen complacency instead of action. We have let languish untapped the potential of generation after generation, and unknowingly today, we watch our past repeat itself before our eyes. And that's really why we have to teach history. Not as some would like it to have been, but has it really happened in truth. There's nobody in this room that needs to hear the statistics of disease, child mortality, suicide, high rates of incarceration. We all know the reality. Most of us have seen it firsthand. Most of us have seen it. Many of you have probably lived it. The problem is that too few Aboriginal leaders in this country have found in the rest of us the partners they need as they seek to scale the heights of indifference, which the kind of polls I just talked about show are held by most Canadians, the kind of indifference which confronts the Aboriginal leadership of this country. We have a future to deliver. We have promises inscribed in the parchment of treaties and the words of Constitution, but you know what's every bit as important is they are also etched in the hearts of so many of our young people who only ask one question, and that is, what do I have to do to succeed? And their lives will be our legacy. In a quote that really marked me very much, the great actor Chief Dan George said, and I quote, "There is a longing among the youth of my nation to secure for themselves and their people the skills that will provide them with a sense of purpose and worth. They will be our new warriors. Their training will be much longer and more demanding," the chief said, "than was in the olden days. But they will emerge with their hand held forward, not to receive welfare, but to grasp a place in society that is rightly ours." Ladies and gentlemen, that, hopefully, is what the next 2 days is all about. Thank you.